The next piece of data representation that we're going to talk about is visualization. And in particular today, what I want to talk about is how visualization can be a form of analysis and help us understand what's going on in our data. So, the first thing I want to talk about are scatter plots, which are ways of representing the relationship between two continuous variables. So each point is an observation. So here we have measurements of petal length and petal width made by Edgar Anderson more than 100 years ago. And each of these dots is an individual petal from an individual iris. So you can see that the relationship between length and width is that as the petals are longer, they're also wider. It's a pretty linear relationship, we might say. Now, one of the things we can do when we're looking at scatter plots is that if we have different groups going into the scatter plot, we can color the points by the group. So it turns out this data set had 3 species of iris in it, Setosa, versicolor, and virginica. And you can see that not only is there this general relationship between length and width that spans across all 3 species, but that the species group, so that Setosa here is the most distinct, the smallest petal width, and there's this big gap. And then versicolor and virginica kind of form this continuum where the smaller ones are versicolor, blah, and the larger ones are virginica. And then there's this region here where you maybe have some trouble telling them apart just by size. So we can look at and see how things group out in this multidimensional space, which can be handy. Another data set comes from Motor Trend that shows engine displacement versus the horsepower of those engines. And you can see that in general, as the displacement increases, the horsepower increases, so bigger engines are more powerful. But if you look, there's these orange, pinkish dots that the slope's not as steep, right? They're growing a little bit more slowly, and the blue ones, the bluish-greenish ones are growing more quickly. And I really need to change this graph for red-green colorblind people. But this one's, so there's these 2 different groups that have different relationship between displacement and gross horsepower. So that is another kind of way that you can use color to represent what's going on in a scatter plot. Now, another thing that you can do when you're looking at your data is if you don't know how they're distributed beforehand, you can make a histogram and see which distributions they follow. So here's some examples of 3 different distributions of data with similar locations. We have the nice symmetrical normal distribution with left tail and right tail. We have the chi-square distribution, which has no left tail, it only has a right tail. And these both have 1 mode. And then you have the uniform distribution here, which has no mode. It has no tails, so it's just everything is in this rectangle. So we can look at some actual data and see which of the distributions they follow. So here we have this set of data here. We can say, yeah, it looks like there's a little tail on this side. So there's a tail on this side. There's only 1. Well, there's these 2 bumps, but maybe if we squint, we can say it just seems like there's only 1 in the middle. So that seems to be a good match to the normal distribution, right? I think that matches pretty well. So we look at those and be like, yep, those are normally distributed. And we could go on with analysis that requires normally distributed data. Now, if we look at these, say, there are no tails, right? There drops down there, and they're pretty, looks like there might be a little bit of a mode here in the middle, but there is no tail on either side. So what I'm guessing, especially because the numbers here, this is 18, it's probably a uniform distribution. And that is the case. Now, I kind of cheated because I created these so I know it was uniform, but these really sharp edges are an even bigger hint that your data are uniformly distributed than any uncertainty in the middle. Finally, our last distribution is this one, and you can see again there's a sharp edge on the left, but there's a tail going out this way, and then we have definitely a single peak here. So this looks like a nice chi-squared distributed variable, and there are our curves again, and yep, it follows the chi-square distribution pretty well. So we wouldn't necessarily call this an outlier, right? This is there are going to be some rare things on a tail. So this is more like far out in the tail rather than outlier. Because an outlier is something that we would consider to be from an entirely different distribution. So here we have two graphs that I've made, and this was generated with some normal data centered around 3, and then this one here is just this extra value that I added that's around 9. And so it's just way out there. And you can see that might be a little confusing with the chi-square distribution from before. Yeah, it might very well be. However, it is different. That is way out there, and that is an outlier. Likewise, we have two potential outliers here. And the interesting thing from this data set is I generated this one randomly as well. This one actually is from the randomly generated data. This is the one I artificially inserted. So it can be hard sometimes. You can get things that are pretty far away even if they're randomly generated. And so you have to be cautious when you visualize an outlier. Sometimes what makes sense is you go and you look at the data then, and there's a typo, right? So if someone's putting the data in and then they move the decimal place to the wrong part, you have something far away. So you might want to go into your data set and inspect this point and see if there's anything about them that make them seem odd. So that's another way of analyzing your data with visualization. I think this is the last slide. It is. Awesome. All right, well, that's the lectures for visualization. I hope you enjoyed them more than I enjoyed making these graphs.